Hello, and welcome to yet another installment of FIT Talks, the oral history program of the Fashion Institute of Technology, one of 64 campuses of the State University of New York. I am April Callahan, Special Collections Curator of Print Collections here at FIT Library. And we are coming to you today from the reading room of Special Collections and College Archives at the Goodman Center, which is located on the FIT campus at the intersection of 27th Street and 7th Avenue in Manhattan, New York City. Today is Thursday, April 6th, and I am joined via Google Meet by our subject of today's oral history, Robert E. Bryan. Robert, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be included in your collection.
Yes. And not just our oral history collection, but our manuscript collections as well.
Right, indeed. Very much so.
So we're here today, of course, to discuss your multi-decade career in fashion. You have worn many proverbial and probably literal hats during this time period. But before we get to discussing that, I was kind of hoping that we could talk a little bit about your childhood and some of your first memories of fashion.
Oh, well, that's going back many a year. I think that it was all up to my parents, who had very traditional classic style. And we're talking about the late 40s and the early 50s. But around 1955, 56, I started to be interested in contemporary rock and roll, and particularly in 55 and 56, rockabilly, Elvis Presley, his kind of a cool cat style. I started wearing a pompadour and what were called bombers, which were these thick rubber sole shoes that had a clip on the top of them. I think they were worn in England too. But at any rate, I just thought I was really cool. And I think I was pretty cool, especially for an 11 and 12-year-old to be dressing that way. But then I became more interested in Little Richard, and I was not willing to go that far in my style. And somehow I just started to recede away from it, and had no style in high school. And I think part of the reason was I was spending more time just watching old movies, 1930s movies on TV, and that would become an influence, not immediately in my style, but eventually. It would be a very big, overwhelming influence. But is that going back far enough and coming up close, not too far?
Could you also tell us a little bit about your education and some of your earlier professional experiences? Because it's my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but that you didn't necessarily study fashion when you were in school.
Well, that's the thing. You know, in those days, I don't think it was as much required that you have a fashion education. I came to it innately and naturally based upon my personal interests. And as I mentioned, I had this obsession with 1930s style, so that had a lot to do with it. But my first job in the business was at Abraham and Strauss, which was a major department store in Brooklyn. And I went to work as first a management trainee and then an assistant buyer in the Groove shop, because I had recently moved to New York in '68, and I had kind of momentarily abandoned my preppy Ivy League style that I got from the University of Virginia and moved into this cooler, hipper style. And so there I was in the Groove shop at Abraham and Strauss. Well, that lasted a year, but the hours were just terrible. I mean, you could be there for 6 weeks over Christmas, 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. So I left and then went to work at the May Department Stores Corporation. And by this time, I had started wearing vintage clothes, which I got from initially bought in the East Village at the store on Avenue B that was run by a rabbi, and he was selling brand new suits from the 40s and 50s for $7
Wow.
and trousers for $2.
So
And
it's
this
dead
was
stock, basically.
absolutely, and this was the dead stock, exactly. And the only people who wanted it were homeless people who couldn't afford anything more, and as it turns out, this small group of fashion leaders in 1970 who were into wearing these vintage clothes, which were so far removed from what everybody else was wearing, which was part of the point, to be distinctive and dress differently. We all cut our hair. We cut our long hair in 1970 even to emphasize the point. In those days, people would say, "Are you in the military?" So they were so short. But at any rate, did I miss something in that question, or was there more?
No, that was your kind of first foray into the field of fashion, of course. But menswear would go on to ultimately become your specialty. Could you tell us a little bit about the general landscape of American men's fashion in the late 60s, early 1970s when you kind of first started?
Well, I think that menswear had been kind of sleeping for a while. And it was at this time, with the youth revolution and all of the changes going on in every aspect for young people. And this certainly included the way they dressed.
Mm-hmm.
And so consequently, things were happening in menswear. And consequently, that's why we had this so-called groove shop, which reflected these changes. And that's where, as I say, I ended up. And it seems strange now, people laugh when they know my whole image to think, what were you doing in the groove? Because that doesn't seem like me at all. And it continued into the early 70s. I mean, I have to say that eventually what was happening in menswear was not very nice, because they moved into polyester, they moved into leisure suits. I mean, it was still fashion, it was still happening, people were talking about it, and I tried to show it in the most flattering way in Menswear magazine, which is where I went after I left the May Department Stores Corporation. And I think I went there in December of 73. My first issue came out in 74. And my influence, this traditional style, was I tried to apply it to what I did at the magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was also appropriate because, in spite of all this polyester leisure suits, there were other people like Ralph Lauren, like Sal Cesarani, and like Giorgio Armani, who were also looking back at the past for inspiration and doing this classic style. Like Ralph Lauren did The Great Gatsby in 74, which was the year my first issues came out at Menswear. So, I mean, I wasn't doing it to emulate them or to be in step with them. It just happens that that was me, the real me, coming out in fashion. And so this menswear explosion continued to happen, but in a different way. There was the mass America that was so excited about their polyester leisure suits. And then there was the more sophisticated clientele, the designer group, as it was called then, who was looking for something more like Ralph Lauren and that what we called updated traditional. That was a very big term at that time.
It's interesting. I've never heard that term before. So you just mentioned menswear, and you were there for quite some time. Could you tell us in what capacity you were overseeing the magazine? What roles were you working at that title?
Okay. Well, you name it, I was doing it. Menswear magazine was the very first Fairchild publication from, I think, like the 1880s. And so in a way, it was an honor to be working at this prestigious, long-running, historic publication. It was for the trade. It came out twice a month. And I shopped the market, I picked the trends, I got the merchandise in, I put the clothes together, I planned the photo shoots, and with the art department, hired the photographers, went on the photo shoot, and did the styling. So basically, and I did not have an assistant, and I didn't think anything of it. I just thought, okay, it's easier to just, I'll do it myself. And that way I will be confident that it's being done the way I want it to be done. So, you know, I'd get the merchandise in, and then I would even pack it up and send it back, which I guess would have been helpful to have somebody do that at least, but nope, they didn't. They saved a fortune.
Yeah. And of course, now we know that a lot of that is about 6 or 7 individual jobs that you just
It is, even then, by the 80s, when I had gone on, well, shall we jump into this? Menswear magazine was in 1982 evolved into M, the Civilized Man.
Mm-hmm.
M, which was the M to the W, woman, for the upscale husband of the wife, who would of course tend to be more traditional. And very fancy production, the best paper, the best printing. And once again, I was it. I was the only person doing it. This was for the consumer. And now it was even up to me to hire the photographer by myself to come up with a location, like the time we shot at West Point, which was always a favorite of everybody, using cadets and models mixed together, putting the whole thing together. And this went on until 92. And I will say that we created quite a stir in the 80s with M, because we were one of the first to start using real people. We started with models that looked like everyday people pretty much. And then we started using actual real people. And everybody was very confused by this, like, what is going on? How are they doing this? I heard that they were talking to other people who had connections with Fairchild and saying, how are they doing this with real people? But it seemed to work out very well. At least it was a much loved publication. Fairchild did not really promote the magazine very well. And I mean, in a way, the 80s was really the perfect decade for a magazine like M, which was a little snobbish and very Anglophile and kind of elitist. And that fit in very well, you know, with that Wall Street affair with the suspenders and the suits and the kind of a dandy look, because that's what we were doing. And that's what I knew how to do better than anybody else at that time.
Yeah.
But eventually, as I say, they decided they weren't making much money with it, and they discontinued it. They sold the list, subscription list, to GQ, and boy, I bet those M subscribers were shocked when they started getting GQ instead of M, the Civilized Man.
Yeah, I'm curious. You know, kind of given your description of the sort of feeling of M, what was the impetus behind using and switching to using real people from models?
There was a feeling that regular guys were put off by models and would relate better to see people like themselves wearing the clothes. And I suppose they could see themselves in the clothes better if they saw people like themselves wearing the clothes rather than some idealized model as much as we tried to make them every day. And also we would photograph them. We'd go out in the street, even with the models, and put them in real life situations. Like if we saw some kids playing ball, we would put them in the ball game. Or there was a little old lady with a carriage on the street, we would have him helping her and repairing a bicycle. So it had a very much of a reality, and it was spontaneous. These situations were not planned. We just went out in the street. We didn't get permission to do it or set up any of these meetings. It just fortunately happened, and it seemed to work, at least with the readers who got it.
And what was kind of the end date of M? I think you mentioned it earlier, but I just want
I think it was 1992 or maybe early 93, 92, 93.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very sad, but Michael Cody, who was was the man under Mr. Fairchild, called me in the midst of a fashion shoot and said he wanted to let me know that they were discontinuing the magazine, but I had nothing to worry about. They wanted me to stay on, and they would find work for me to do at Fairchild. And I was in kind of a state of a shock. So I just kept going with the photo shoot. I couldn't stop, even though I couldn't say, okay, no point in doing this anymore. The magazine's over. I just kept on working with the photographer, setting up shoots. I guess I was in some kind of a daze, but
yeah. Or you're just the consummate professional, I suppose.
Well, maybe against all sense of reason or rhyme, professional. But then after that, I worked for DNR, which was the menswear newspaper, also around forever. And it was back to trade, but in a way it was a little more relaxing because there wasn't quite the pressure. I felt like I could be even perhaps more experimental in what I did. And then at the same time, I was doing something called the W Men's Portfolio, which was in a way to replace M with the M flavor. And it was so well received. I think that's actually why the New York Times ultimately came to me. But I mean, I had also been doing the W Christmas gift issue, as I had been doing the M Christmas gifts for those 10 years. And this was so well received. The advertising people sent me all these letters of people saying, boy, we love that issue. So I got the offer. Shall I go into this?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I got the offer from the New York Times, and I was so contented working, even in circumstances that were not as elevated as the Civilized Man. I kind of felt like I was going to be at Fairchild forever. I mean, those sort of things would never happen now. Everybody's so, okay, 2 years, I got to find a new job, got to jump onto something better. But I was not very aggressive with it, I'm afraid. I was contented. But everyone said, no, it's the New York Times. You have to say yes to the New York Times. You can't turn them down. This is the greatest chance. And so I told one of the people who was the hands-on runner of Fairchild, who shall remain nameless, and he said, oh, that's great. Congratulations. Goodbye. Because we had always had that kind of a relationship. Which is one of the reasons I thought I should leave. It was a good idea to leave. That was a good argument. But then this Michael Cody, who had been such a fan of mine, came over and he practically doubled my salary offer. And I thought, well, if they thought I was that good before, why have I been working for this meager sum all these years? I mean, they offered me more than the New York Times was offering me. But I decided I had to go to the Times with the encouragement of everybody. And it was I was getting into something new. It was a change of pace. I was 50 years old. I may not have looked it, but I was nonetheless. So it was jumping into something totally new than at that age. And I just wanted to show, this was the last issue I did for Fairchild, for Daily News Record.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a tribute to college fashion of the 1920s, which was, once again, there was not a particular trend for it, but it was my love. And I figured, okay, this will be my farewell to
Right.
Fairchild. And went to the New York Times, and continuing my love of the 20s and 30s, my first issue for the New York Times was photographed at Hoover Dam.
Wow.
Which was the ultimate 30s expression. And it was completely tailored clothing, as you see. And it was a big hit. I don't know why I didn't take pictures, but they put the poster of this cover all over the city as a billboard. I pasted it up here and there. And I don't know, I wish I had thought about the future, that, oh, wouldn't this be great to have this, to see it posted all over the city, my first issue. But I was oblivious for some reason. And then the years began at the New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
And everything was great for the first 5 years. They brought me in, I should say, because the person they had before, they felt did not understand the New York Times men's area, that he was too experimental and they wanted a more classic approach. And of course, where else would they go but me for that? Well, things change. And so by 2000, 2001, everybody above me had changed. All the people who had hired me were gone, and there were new people in the place. I had lived through this sort of thing at Fairchild many times without any problem, but it was going to be more difficult at the New York Times. So they wanted me to do something different, and I was trying to do the sort of thing that they wanted to do. And my heart was not really in it. But I mean, most people still thought it looked good, even though it was not exactly the trendy fashion style that they wanted. And in the midst of all this, the person who was the head of the style department really wanted somebody new. And at the Times, you can't fire somebody just because you feel like you want somebody new. You have to have good reason. They have to have done something wrong. They have to be a disaster in some way. So he was out to make my life miserable. And as I guess a masochist, I went along for a couple of years suffering through it. And then in the midst of all that, I was celebrated by the entire industry at the Rainbow Room at Rockefeller Center. And they produced this magazine all about me. And I think that is something that also did not make this individual very happy, that I was taking away from his position and his grandeur. I mean, these things happen I guess they happen in every business, not just fashion, but there may be something about fashion that makes it even more likely.
Yeah.
So in early 2006, I left the Times and worked freelance. Should I be roving ahead this way?
Yeah, I do want to touch back on something really briefly, just in the context of the industry recognizing your work at the Rainbow Room in 2004, right?
Yes.
2004.
Right.
You know, I would say many people within the industry know you best as a stylist and an editor as well. And I kind of want to speak more about the styling aspect of that, because I think from the time that you started within the industry, that role kind of only grew in influence. So would you talk about the role of the stylist like in the 70s versus like moving forward into what we're seeing now?
Well, just one other note. I forgot to add before that I also wrote all the fashion reports that went along with the fashion stories. And this continued right through into the New York Times. I would write the introduction to the fashion stories. But the idea of hiring a stylist never occurred to me, because I thought, well, what am I doing now? Well, I don't know about now, but I know about in the 90s, in the early aughts, fashion editors would routinely hire a stylist to come in and put together the fashion shoot. And that was one of the things that really bothered me, because I felt that that was part of my job, that they had hired me because of my taste to put these clothes together in a way that reflected the trends and reflected my taste and my aesthetic. And so, yes, there's no question the stylist sort of came out of nowhere and became a very important part of the fashion industry. And they had all kinds of work from all these publications who didn't seem competent to do their own styling job. And they'd bring in somebody else who would invariably present something in an extremely edgy, trendy, of the moment way, which is, I guess, what they wanted. But I don't think it was ever appropriate for the New York Times, which is why initially they had brought me in, because the guy who was there, I don't know if he hired stylists, but he was presenting things in a way that had that edgier look to them.
Mm-hmm. I just think it's like so interesting, because like you have your work, your body of work spans that kind of like splintering of positions within the industry, but you were still doing them all yourself.
I was still doing them all myself. Yes. And even when I went to the New York Times, I thought, well, somebody said, well, you have to get an assistant, because everybody has always had an assistant at the New York Times as the fashion director. And I thought, well, I never had one before. Why do I need? And then I said, okay, well, maybe just to get in the merchandise, make the calls and make the returns. Well, this woman on the staff, really nice woman, she had a friend, David Farber, who she called and thought that we would get along. Well, we got along extremely well. He is one of the nicest people in the fashion industry, and he is now in a version of my job at the New York Times at this very moment. So I kind of changed his life, but I worked with him the whole time. So that was the first time at the New York Times where I had an assistant. And he helped with the details that I thought that an assistant should be helping with, while I was still doing the main part of planning what the shoots would be, the trends of the season, putting the clothes together when they came in, hiring a photographer, all that sort of thing, while he was taking care of getting the merchandise in and out and making all these little phone calls that needed to be made along the way, which is a tremendous help. And ultimately, I had him do some photo shoots on his own. And I remember that there was upset at the higher levels, because you're letting him well, why are you letting him do these shoots? You're in Paris. How can he be doing it here? And, you're not here. And well, as you see, it turned out pretty well, because he's now doing my job 20 years later
Yeah, well, I mean,
So,
mentorship is so important for any industry, really.
right, exactly. And I have to say, maybe it's bragging a little, but there have been other people who have said that I really was an influence and helped them and encouraged them in their career. And it wasn't like I thought, oh, I got to be nice and do that. It just seemed like the thing to do. And I enjoyed doing it,
Mhm.
helping these people, encouraging these people.
Yeah. Did you have anybody within your own career that served as a mentor or an influence on you?
Well, not in fashion, but there was a friend who got me to move to New York. And boy, if that wasn't an influence, I mean, I think he's probably the most influential person in my life to get me to move to New York. Now, he didn't get me into the fashion business. That was all on my own. But it all wouldn't have happened if I hadn't moved to this city. I mean, he said, you have to live in New York. It is the only place to be in this country. So, and this was kind of a bold move for me because I mean, throughout my life, I have tended not to be very adventurous. And at this time, I'd graduated from the University of Virginia, where I had my Ivy League training, basically. And I had gone to GW Law School for a year, but I decided that I hated it, even though I did well enough. But 3 days after I graduated, I moved to New York City. And it was all because this friend of mine had encouraged me to. But in terms of fashion, I really had my own ideas about fashion. And I don't know. I guess I couldn't be encouraged. I was set in my ways already. What with my love of classic style.
Right, right. Well, there is, obviously a huge difference between style and fashion,
There is. And boy, I mean, of course, in doing what I did, I had to reflect fashion because that's what I was supposed to be doing, was showing the trend, showing the fashion, particularly at Menswear Magazine. And in a more general way at the Civilized Man and the New York Times. I mean, we weren't going to show the trendiest, but we were going to show things that reflected what was happening in the business. And so that's what I set out to do. But I mean, I have always had, I didn't show you before, a picture of me from 1974, my second year, what am I saying? 6 months into my menswear career.
Nice. Love it.
We did a story on what the fashion editors wear and think. And this was my picture for the story.
Yeah.
And we included, Bob Beauchamp and all these other people who were, some of them are still alive, like Bob. Anyway.
Well, let's talk about your own relationship with fashion a little bit further. What types of clothes, besides your early inspiration in kind of 1920s, 1930s, what types of clothes have you always preferred? And how would you describe your relationship to style versus fashion, since we kind of got off on that track?
Right. Well, I guess it started with after the late 50s and the rock and roll. It was Ivy League, which was the influence, and that has been sort of the ground of everything ever since. Mm-hmm. But there was the more particular 1930s classic style, and I always referred back to that in some way or other, particularly in the fashion business, when every day, I mean, it wasn't uncommon, and most people wore a suit and a tie to go into the market in those days, which seems inconceivable. But in the 70s, 80s, 90s, I always wear a suit and a tie, a jacket and a tie, a tattersall waistcoat. What I wore always had the flavor of 30s style. But I always tried to reflect in some way, maybe the type of tie that was being worn, or the pattern of the jacket, or the colors, or way it was put together, to reflect in my own subtle way the trends that were happening at the moment. And this was it throughout. But I was never seen casually, or rarely seen casually, by anybody in the fashion industry at that time. But, I think through the 80s, I didn't even have jeans. I wore khaki pants for casual. But ultimately, in retirement, needless to say, I rarely wear a jacket and a tie. The only time I do is for some vintage event like the Governor's Island 1920s lawn party.
Yeah.
Then I bring it out full force, and it's fun and I enjoy it, but I'm not about to do it on a daily basis. But on a daily basis, it's sort of a Ivy League, but mixed with, I have about 200 sweaters that start with the 30s and go through the 70s. So I bring in all of these various periods and elements in my sweaters and in my shirts, and put it all together in a casual way. It still has a vintage look for sure, but it's not necessarily 30s, and it's not necessarily, certainly not dress up. It's done in a casual way, and it's a blending of old and new together. But I think it stands out from, needless to say, what you see on the subway and what most people are wearing. It's still, people would say, oh, well, that's interesting looking. What is that you're wearing?
Well, it's because you have a point of view.
I do. And as you say, this style is so much better than, anybody can just follow fashion trends, but to have your own personal style and to be able to adapt it now and then as to certain things that are happening. And I'm not so concerned about that as I was when I was in the fashion industry, where I felt somewhat compelled to reflect what was happening, even though I was doing my vintage style. And it worked. I didn't mention that I was on the best dress list, international best dress list for the industry in 1975. And then in 1995, which is the year that I went to the New York Times. So, I guess I was on top of the world at that point, the New York Times and the best dress list.
Well, let's talk a little bit more, because you mentioned your freelance career, which was after the Times. How long were you freelancing, and what were you doing?
Well, I was freelancing from 2006 until 2009, broadly speaking. And for the most part, it was magazines around the country that wanted, they knew who I had been, they knew my reputation, and they wanted to bring that into their local markets. And so they would pay me to shop the market, which God knows was a great deal for them, because they were not about to shop the market. And they were in Seattle or wherever. So I had access to these designers to get to borrow the clothes, which they didn't. And I would have them shipped to wherever the location was. With one publication, I was able to go to Hawaii and to Australia. So it's not a bad situation there for a while. And I did other things, like John Bartlett hired me to style a show that he did, something that I had never done before.
I think we have the runway videos of that.
Oh, right. Yes, you do.
In the collection, the manuscript
you
collection.
Have a good memory. You've kept good track of that. But yeah, so, and I think you have most of the freelance work that I did there. It didn't make a lot of money at it, but it kept me busy. And as I say, I got some fun and some trips out of it too. And I think the biggest thing that happened was, well, you know what happened in 2008. And at that point, regular freelance work, many of these publications who had been hiring me were having a hard time of even being in business, and many of them didn't stay in business. So the freelance work pretty much dried up. And then when I was about ready to say, okay, I'm practically 65, it's about time to throw in the towel. But then the CFDA, the American Designer Group, came to me, and they were doing this series on American fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And I had been recommended as the person to be the editor, the writer, the selector of photographs for their edition for menswear, for American fashion menswear.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me 6 months. It was grueling. I mean, as Dorothy Parker said, I hate to write, but I love to have written. And and that's how I felt about this. I love to read my copy. I think it sounds so good. I'm more proud of the fashion copy than the pictures. It turns out this was not just about showing the history of menswear. It was supposed to reflect contemporary designers and to fit them into the trends that I had selected in the history of American menswear. So I had plenty of wonderful vintage pictures I loved included in it. But in addition to that, there were all of these more contemporary designers. One other little thing here. I picked many of the pictures I picked from things that I had done. And this picture I didn't do, but this was a picture I bought at a vintage show in Chicago, which I have on my dresser over here. But everybody thought that's so the epitome of American sportswear and fashion and style. So they made it the cover. So lo and behold, this guy from 1940 is somehow ended up as the cover of my book.
And he has no idea.
And he has no idea. Some people have said, "Oh, is that you?" And I said, "Me, a football player? I don't think so."
Well, this is interesting because like you've had such a long career and you've engaged with the fashion industry from so many different angles. And this book kind of coming at the tail end before you retired, more or less, that was a novel experience coming to you at the kind of the end of your career. So are there other experiences like that have been particularly dear to you?
Well, I had always written, as I say, along with the stories. So this was a continuation of that. But I thought that it was about the most appropriate way to end my career. That I have to say, people had always said, "Oh, you should write a book. Oh, you should write a book." And I thought, oh, how in the world am I supposed to do that? I don't have the energy to approach somebody, and I don't know that I really want to. And so when they came to me and said, here's the publisher, here's the whole thing, just go ahead and do it, I had to say yes to that. So at the end of my career, I literally wrote the book about me. But that I don't think there was anything else that really came close to that. As I say, I did John Bartlett's, I styled a fashion show, and that was something new. Oh, and also there are these co-artists, David McDermott and Peter McGough. Well, Peter McGough was making a movie, a downtown movie that was set in the 30s. So he hired me to style the movie.
Oh, that's fun.
And so I went to various designers, and it was women's and men. So that was something that I had, oddly enough, never really done women's wear. I was indeed really strictly menswear. So I got the women's clothes, I got the men's. I was there for the filming. I went to the premiere, which was held at some hip and groovy downtown location, the Bowery Hotel. That was it. And it was a cool, fabulous crowd, and there was my work up on the screen. So that was fun too.
No, that's great. I love that. And well, you know, on the converse side of kind of like, you know, unique experiences that you had, you have been doing this for so long, and you saw the ins and the outs of the industry. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how the industry should grow and or evolve.
Well, I don't think they should lose track of what people actually wear. Now, obviously, what people wear is very different from back in my day, but still, there are things that you see, even in the New York Times, dare I say, and other publications, that, as they always used to say, who is going to wear that? But I can't help but think that there's a lot of truth in that you should maintain. Yes, it's great to have a sense of fantasy, particularly in fashion shows, is great. I mean, Tom Brown has been bringing on plenty of fantasy, and it makes I guess the fashion show can be pretty boring if you just show what people wear every day. So it's great to have this sense of fantasy and showtime. But when it comes down to reality, and maybe what you're showing people, that this is what's coming for the season, you should stay in touch with what people will actually wear. And I don't mean just everybody in the street, but people who have some sense of style, what they will wear.
Yeah. What would you like the industry and or just people in general to remember about you, whether it be personally or professionally?
Well, I guess my sense of style, my sense of classic style. I mean, there was nobody ever in the men's fashion business who wore predominantly vintage clothes. I mean, I remember this DNR gossip columnist in the 70s referred to me as Mr. Old Clothes. That was before the term vintage had been invented. But that not only did I wear vintage style, but I made it somehow not only work in the contemporary world, but in many cases, I was wearing things that were before what was coming. Like when Armani appeared in the 70s, he was doing a 40s look. I was wearing it before. People thought, oh, is that Armani? I said, no, that's my $10 40 suit that I've been wearing for years. So I think I should be remembered for my vintage style, and consequently being on the best dress list through vintage style, which is pretty amazing, and getting by covering contemporary designers reflecting this style, and in some cases inspiring those people with what I was wearing for the coming season that they wanted to try out. But I mean, ultimately, I guess having written the book, for my honor at the Rainbow Room, yes, the industry honor, I guess I couldn't be more proud of anything than having the entire industry fet me and honor me at the Rainbow Room. But I mean, I think even LIM has forgotten it at this point. But that's fashion, in with the new, out with the old. But then the history of fashion that I wrote, the American Fashion Menswear for the CFDA. I mean, I hope that will continue and be a reflection upon what I accomplished and my understanding of the history of menswear,
Mhm.
and the way I was able to adapt vintage classic style to contemporary style and dressing and trends.
Well, thank you. We had kind of slotted this to end at 12, but of course we got a late start today. But I don't want to take up too much of your time because I know
I have plenty
other
of time.
things.
I'm retired.
Okay. Do you have any other kind of like additional thoughts or topics that you kind of want to touch on before we sign off today?
Let me see. I mean, you can edit this if what I think. You know, I really, aside from those few problems now and then in the fashion industry, I think I had a wonderful life in the industry. Met incredible people, and perhaps more importantly than anything else, I traveled.
Mm.
I traveled all over this country doing this feature for the Civilized Man, where we do best clothes in the best stores. I could literally pick out any city I wanted to go to, and if I could find a good store there, and go there. So I saw America, and I saw Europe, and on a regular basis, I traveled to these countries and these cities and became very familiar with them. And I still have friends, you know, I think I have about 70 Facebook friends who are from the industry still. But I just want to say that it was a wonderful life in the fashion industry. And one of the best things was seeing the world, the traveling, which, you know, my parents didn't go to Europe until they were in their 70s. That was it. One trip. They never even went to California. So that's why I really appreciate having traveled as I have. And, you know, there was hard work. It was really deadlines and grueling, but in the end, looking back, it was a wonderful life.
You can't ask for more than that.
No, really.
Robert, thank you so much for joining us for our oral history series.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for
and for anybody. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. Of course, this will go up on FIT's databases and potentially on our YouTube channel as well. So I just want to add on here for anybody who's actually seeing this video that we do have our manuscript collection, which contains all this information that we've been discussing here today on Robert's body of work. So it is here at FIT Special Collections and College Archives if anyone wants to make an appointment to come view it. Robert, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you again. I am thrilled with this, and I'm so delighted that this interview, along with what I donated, is the perfect package. I don't think either would have been nearly as good without the other. So happy marriage, and thank you for being the pastor and bringing them together.
Yes, I concur.
Okay, have a good day. Thank you.